At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injuries and additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Warndorf, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Ken, welcome once again to The Politics Guys.
It is great to be back.
It is always fun getting to do this with you. And I tell you, always the biggest things happen when we're doing the show.
Maybe we should do it less because these big things that happen aren't always so good.
That's what it is, right? We're causing the chaos that exists. Yeah. Anyway, well, because weirdly, we got a little bit delayed today in recording the show, but I'm kind of glad that we did because we're going to pivot a little bit and we're actually going to lead the show, not with the budget bill, not with the 5 things you've accomplished. We're going to get to those, I promise. But we have to talk about what occurred between President Trump, President Zelenskyy, and Vice President J.D. Vance not long before we began recording today. So there was supposed to be a minerals agreement signed today between the United States and Ukraine. There was actually going to be a big announcement about it. They were going to sign it in public. There was a news conference scheduled. All that has been canceled after a meeting this morning that, as CBS put it, and this might be the most tame way I put it, had, quote, descended into insults and chaos, end quote. And yes, it did. It absolutely did. So I watched this in its entirety. So what happened? I couldn't take enough notes. As a political scientist, I want to put this in a little bit of context. I have never seen an interaction like this. I have not studied an interaction like this in my career. I can think of no precedents to put it on. And I don't say that lightly. If you've listened to a lot of the politics guys, you know that I'm very careful to try to put things in historic and world context. And so, again, I can't think of a great comparable example to what went down. It really starts to take a nosedive. If you haven't already watched the video, I encourage you to do that. When Vance starts to really get aggressive with President Zelenskyy. And so Zelenskyy attempts to outline why there are some issues with just wanting a ceasefire with Russia. And he says, look, it goes back a number of presidents, Zelenskyy says. This comes back to Obama, and we signed an agreement, and Macron is there, and it's 2014, and they're talking. And he said, look, and what did they do? They invade us again. We need to think more broadly. And so that gets Vance angry. Although it appears to me that maybe there'd been a conversation going on earlier that we're not quite as privy to, because he seemed to be coming out hot right out of the gate, which culminates with Vice President Vance saying, look, I would never go to the Ukraine because you're just going to bring people on a propaganda tour. And it is disrespectful to attack this administration. And then this leads Zelenskyy to saying, look, Russia is going to do these kinds of things again. If we need to deal with it now, and if you don't, you're going to feel it in the future. And this is where then President Trump begins to step in just a major way and says, look, you don't tell us how to feel. These are quotes I have for you. You don't tell us how to feel. You are in no position to dictate how we are to feel. And then he would go on to say that they're in a bad situation because of you. And then he'd start just repeating, you don't have the cards, you don't have the cards. J.D. Vance jumps into this and says, you haven't said thank you. And you campaigned, quote, you campaigned for the opposition, end quote. And this leads Donald Trump to start really getting upset. And then he says, look, we gave you through this stupid president. He's referring to Biden there. And he goes on to say $3.5 billion without our military. It had been over in 3 days. Zelenskyy says, I've heard this from Putin before. And then things are just completely, whatever semblance was left ends when Zelenskyy rightfully points out that that's a Putin talking point. And that leads Trump to saying, look, if we get a ceasefire, you're going to take it. And Biden is not a smart person. So, Ken, I want to start with I want to talk about this, but I want to start by saying we have sometimes had a little bit of space between us when it came to thinking about the Trump position's foreign policy as it relates to Russia, right? For consistently, you have argued, and I'm going to give you credit for this, you've consistently argued that Putin's foreign policy is the Trump administration foreign policy, that there is no paper between those two. And I have several times pushed back a little bit on those fronts. I have to say, and I don't take this lightly, you were right and I was wrong. Even though I thought there was just a little bit of space, it is clear if there was any suggestion that there was a little bit of space, this meeting absolutely ends it. And it is apparent even to me that Putin's foreign policy is President Donald Trump's foreign policy. And I don't know how anybody can make the case otherwise. And I have tried to.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll get to hear Jay try to make the case otherwise on a different episode.
That's true. Well, maybe we'll have to do a 4-person and we can Jay, what is the difference between Putin's policy?
I didn't, I was tied up until just before we started recording. So I did not get to watch the video of this as you did. And I listened to your description of it carefully. And I also, while you were talking, were trying to read some news reports about it. And, one speech that it sounds like to me, again, saying I didn't see this video, but there's the famous speech that Hitler gave at the Reichstag in 1939 after the Munich conference with Chamberlain, where Chamberlain had gone to Munich and had given Hitler and Mussolini a list of 30 countries, which they named, 30 specific countries, and asked Hitler that, in exchange for basically, in exchange for the Allied powers not intervening to help Czechoslovakia, which Hitler had already invaded, that he would agree not to attack 30 other countries that were named. And he responded to that by giving, a very sneering and mocking speech at the Reichstag, where he read the list of the 30 countries, in the most sneering, obnoxious, aggressive way that he could, to try to invoke laughter from all the Reichstag members that were, listening to the speech at the ridiculousness and patheticness of Chamberlain's request that they promise not to attack these 30 countries. And that tone sounds to me like maybe a precedent for the kind of tone that I'm hearing that Vance and Trump took today with Zelenskyy.
But in some ways, it's almost worse than that, because in the sense of Chamberlain, I mean, he's duped, but he at least thinks he's getting something. And
Chamberlain thinks that he's willing to give up on Czechoslovakia if Hitler will agree to not attack other countries in Europe.
I don't see what the equivalent here is. What besides giving Trump everything he wants?
Giving Putin everything he wants, right? Yeah, exactly. Right. Trump's trying to give
Putin
Putin
going to Hitler and saying, what, take all 30 countries. We won't even bother to. We won't even pretend.
Right. But Chamberlain's, I'm saying Hitler's response to that, which was sneering and ridicule and kind of using that as a kind of theatrical stage set to just ridicule the Western desire that Hitler not invade more countries. I feel like that's a little bit echoed in the way that Trump and Vance today had a kind of, this seems like it was a theatrical setup, right? It seems
and given
when they invited Zelensky to the White House, they must have already been planning to have this altercation with him.
Maybe. I mean, the other thing that's possible, and this was kind of a minor story that we could have picked up on, but of course, yesterday there was kind of the big nothing burger of the Epstein paper, or, the Epstein files, that also gets rolled out not to everybody, but just to particular right-wing influencers. And so the other possibility, Ken, is that I kind of read this as if you make the news here, you take attention off of what is really a divisive, conspiracy portion. There's a division among conspiracy theorists on the right about the Epstein files. I'm not wondering if you pick this fight to try to take attention away from that terribleness, because what was trending this morning when you took a look at X with the other platforms was, come on, Trump, come on, Bondi, get this together. We want the Epstein files. So that's another possibility that I would float. This was a way you pick this fight. You believe, obviously they believe it, but it's also just good framing because you're taking it off the really terrible yesterday framing of how they, the binders coming out with people in their hands. I don't know. What do you think about? Again, we've talked about that kind of sleight of hand before. Yeah, you're doing something terrible over here, so you do something stupid over here. Not stupid, but you do something bombastic over here to disappear from it.
I agree with you that is a modus operandi that Trump loves to use, but I actually don't think that applies in this case because to me, what's going on here is that Trump has basically been pushing the Putin line on Ukraine forever. But it's one of the few issues that there's still a lot of dissent within the Republicans, right? There's a lot of Republicans, especially in Congress, a lot of conservative editorialists in the conservative media who don't want to give up on Ukraine, and so I think that's a anytime that Trump can't get all the Republicans to line up behind him, I think he sees that as a problem that he needs to address, and so I think that a lot of the more hawkish Republicans were elated by the idea that Zelensky's actually going to come to the White House and get to talk to Trump, and they might be able to agree on something. Maybe Trump's going to demand some mineral rights or something in Ukraine, but at least he's going to provide.
And they had agreed to that. That was supposed to get signed this afternoon.
Yeah. But I think that what some people are hoping is that the U.S. would give security guarantees in exchange for that. That hadn't happened yet. But that might have been something that a lot of Republicans could have been broadly on board with, was supporting Trump's idea that we should take mineral rights, I guess, through extortion, but at least getting security guarantees for Ukraine against Putin in exchange for that. But I think Trump never wanted to do anything like that. He wanted to take the straight Putin line. He never wanted to give Ukraine any security guarantees. And so I think the problem that he was up against was, how does he stop the Republicans who want to defend Ukraine from continuing to dissent from the Putin line on that issue? And so I think a theatrical confrontation like this could have the effect of intimidating other Republicans. Like, it's so obvious now that Trump is not going to do anything other than support the Putin line.
So this is directed at Congress. This is directed at Republican, congressional Republicans specifically.
Congressional Republicans, like, stop talking about me defending Zelensky. If I even have to talk to Zelensky, I'm going to debate him. I'm going to berate him, and my vice president is going to throw cuss words at him, and we're going to associate him with Biden, so that helping him is helping Biden. And then that just is I think putting that much more of an obstacle in the path of any Republicans or conservatives who would still want to defend Ukraine.
Well, it is bizarre to me. It is absolutely bizarre to me what a dime shift this has been in terms of Republicans. And really the last time I can think of such a hard pivot, the closest I can think of is when Donald Trump is first getting taken a little more seriously in the Republican primary, and he moves from this fringe, of course we would never support Trump, to, well, maybe. But the Republican shift on the position towards Russia is going to be one that we study, I think, in the future.
Yeah, and my read on it is that there was always a certain hardcore of basically pro-Russian, pro-Putinites amongst the Republicans, but that was never a majority before. But then I think what happened is, Trump took that line. A certain number of them just wanted to always align themselves with Trump, so they didn't care enough about Ukraine to want to fight Trump, so they just switched. But then there was a certain number of them who did care enough about Ukraine and about Russia and didn't switch, and so he's trying to just pound them into submission now.
Well, and again, this comes on the heel, and this, they did talk about this last week, right? I mean, this comes after the week after which Trump has called Zelenskyy a dictator, right? Wrongfully indicated that he has withheld there being elections, when, of course, that is in fact how the Ukrainian constitution works once there's an invasion. Falsely claimed that Zelenskyy has no popular support, that his percentage is at 4%. Again, I don't want to get into all of that since obviously Mike and Jay handled some of that. But this is a pattern. We're seeing this. We're seeing this right, and those are the same exact talking points. So for me, when I watched this, I was thinking in my head when Zelenskyy finally said, "I've heard this from Putin before," right? I think those are the words that are going to go down in infamy, if you will.
Yeah. Well, and don't forget that he also, Trump had us vote on the opposite side of every one of our allies and with Russia at the UN last week on the question of, should we acknowledge the third anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? We voted not to acknowledge that. At the UN.
Well, we didn't even vote for our own watered down resolution once what was included simply said that Russia invaded Ukraine, right? We abstained. We abstained from our own resolution.
Right. No, he is simply advancing Putin's line on all foreign policy issues, and that not only includes basically trying to pressure Ukraine, very hard to just surrender its war with Russia and surrender its country, basically. But also, Putin is very, very interested in breaking up all the Western alliances, and Trump is doing everything he can to break up all the Western alliances.
No, and that's an excellent point. That is an excellent point, because now what we have to think about in terms of if you're Europe, there's a NATO. But there is clearly not a NATO, right? And what I mean by that is to say, and we talked about this a little bit before we got on the show, before we started recording the show, but, an agreement without anyone who's willing to enforce the agreement is not an agreement anymore, which, again, that sounds an awful lot like a Putin. And so if you're Europe now, you have to be thinking, and it might be one thing. I think there are some who keep saying, well, like, what does it matter? It's just the Ukraine. And the answer is to say, no, it's not just Ukraine. It has to do with the broader fact that there is no seeming end to Putin's ambition. And we need to take him. Well, again, another Trump parallel, right? We need to start believing the things that Putin and Trump say and stop what I think has been often the case and say, well, this is a negotiating tactic, or this is, does that happen historically? Yes. But there is no evidence to suggest that either Putin nor Trump is using language as a bombastic, setting a boundary. They are saying the things that they mean.
Yeah, I mean, even sometimes in other situations where Trump himself might claim that he's only saying things as a negotiating tactic, like I think when he talks about putting tariffs on Canada, he'll say, well, it's only because they're letting too much fentanyl come in across their border into the United States, and if they would address that, then I won't put tariffs on Canada. But yet that's all false, because only 1% of the fentanyl in the United States is coming in across the Canadian border. They have law enforcement and security cooperation with the United States to try to stop that, and he is going to put a tariff on Canada, I think. And so he brings
it back up again. You're absolutely right.
Back up again.
Yep.
Yeah, it's going to happen, and it's not really about fentanyl, right? So even where he says he's doing this just as a negotiating tactic, I think really what he wanted to do was put a tariff on Canada for the purpose of causing dissension within our Western alliances, and he's just sort of trying to misdirect people into thinking that he's using it as a negotiating tactic to get them to crack down harder on fentanyl smuggling.
Absolutely,
like that.
Absolutely. So yeah, I we don't want to spend all of our time on this, but it's a big deal, and yeah, again, it was hard. I watch a lot of things. I have covered a lot of politics. I've worked in DC. I have never seen anything like what we saw today. And undoubtedly, this is not the last time we're going to be talking about this issue, given that whether it's us or it's the other hosts, So.
Well, and it also goes along with, there's some other, with the military, he fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who by law had a term of years. He fired all the JAGs and all the services.
And I'll be honest, the JAGs are probably the more concerning. Again, they're both bad, but I'd say the JAGs are the more concerning of the two.
Yeah, he wants a military that will not be constrained by the rule of law, and so that's why he's firing all the JAGs.
Well, and we don't, and that's not. I'm going to be clear. That's not Ken Katkin speaking. I mean, you are, but J.D. Vance said the same thing. I mean, he explicitly said, we don't want lawyers who are going to stop us from doing what we do. That's what he said.
He said it, yeah. And that's also what almost all the living former defense secretaries said, including Mattis, who was Trump's own former defense secretary. Yeah. So he's doing a lot of things to undermine our military, the uses of our military, and its ability to protect the rule of law. And I think for NATO now, there are countries in NATO that are former Soviet satellite republics like Poland, who in the past could have thought, well, Russia's never going to invade us because we're in NATO and the U.S. will protect us. But they have to be realizing now that even though we're all in NATO, if Trump's running the U.S. will not protect them and will not honor our NATO obligations. And so I think that you will see the European countries making an independent military response in Ukraine, even whether the U.S. is part of that or not. And that's really, that is really tearing at the heart of the Western alliances, where we're supposed to be having a joint uniform military policy.
Yeah. No, and those are excellent points. So Ken, any last thoughts on this before we move on to the things we thought we were going to do?
Those were really my last thoughts on it. It is just a very breaking story, and I take it that whoever hosts next weekend's show is going to wind up talking about it some more, because it's just breaking right now. But I do think, to me, like, it's partly about Ukraine and Trump's animosity for Zelenskyy and his love for Putin and his willingness to carry out Putin's foreign policies. But I also think from a Putin standpoint, it's as much about breaking up the Western alliances as about actually any kind of settlement to the Ukraine territorial issues.
Well, what we were going to start with when we were first putting the show together was what seemed like kind of late breaking news at that juncture, was the budget bill coming out of the House. So let's move over to the budget bill for a minute, and then that way when we can, because we're going to come back to the White House in a minute. So let's give ourselves a break. We'll step across the street. We'll head over to the Capitol building. Budget bills are always, as the Beatles put it, a long and winding road, Ken. Aren't they, though? But let's give a quick little bit of review of where we are, where we've been, kind of where we're headed. So obviously, early on, President Trump has indicated that he wants a big, beautiful bill. One big, beautiful bill. But the Senate Republicans have kind of had balked a little bit initially at that and really wanted to go a two-bill direction. And the reason for this is that many Republicans wanted to separate out what they saw as being a larger, more controversial, especially in the House, a more difficult pass to a budget from military and primarily immigration reforms. And to be clear, I mean, this isn't just Trey saying it. That is precisely even what Senator Langford was arguing. We need to get back to that kind of immigration, and then we can talk about funding. The House really wanted to proceed with a single bill, and I think in large part probably because it does not, I mean, there's just not a lot of wiggle room. And so the more bills you have, the more points of failure you have. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It wasn't positive that they were going to make it because they can only lose 2 votes. However, the House just this week on Thursday was able to pass the framework for that bill with some help from Trump with only a single Republican dissent, and that would be Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Now, the way forward is still not entirely clear. Like both parties have utilized in recent years, the process to bring the budget bill forward, or this one beautiful bill since it includes the budget, is called reconciliation. You've probably seen that. You might have heard that if you're a listener floating around. What that means, though, is it is a way to bypass some of the more difficult Senate rules if a budget bill doesn't change the top dollar line amount of what's happening. So what does that all mean? Let me just give you a quick run through on this. So over in Senate land, so Congress is composed of a House and a Senate. In Senate land, to get things done, for most things, you need 60 votes. Why do you need 60 votes? Because in the Senate, they have what's called a filibuster. There's a way to stop bills from moving forward by talking about them. Now, generally speaking, they don't do it the way you see it in the movies anymore. This doesn't mean that somebody's standing up and just talking endlessly. What it kind of gets down to it's a procedural move that means, well, if you don't have 60 votes, then we won't continue to move the thing forward. And that 60 votes, that's a way to stop debate, and that's called cloture. And you're probably going to see those words floating around if you pay attention and you read what's going on with the budget, especially as we see what happens. Now, what reconciliation is, it's a way to move forward without needing cloture, and so therefore you don't need 60 votes, but you just need a majority. And in this case, as long as you have 50, you have a majority, because J.D. Vance, the vice president, any vice president, is their technical constitutional job is to oversee the Senate. So he can come in and tie break if need be. So that process has now started. Senate Republicans are going to have to try to take that up. Are they going to work with their 2-bill solution and try to put it together? That's yet to be seen. Are they going to work on something? The other big issue for Republicans on this, Ken, of course, is one of the elements is how much of the Trump tax cuts do we want to put forward? Because the Trump tax cuts are going to cost to move forward somewhere in the vicinity of $1 to $3 trillion over 10 years. And one of the things you have to do in reconciliation is to be neutral. And so there's some complicated processes going on. I don't want to get too technical. So they're kind of trying to work through that. And I'll give Massie credit. Representative Massie, I think he's right. He was sharing some things. He said, look, Republicans, we only seem to care about the deficit when we're not in power. But as it appears right now, most of the ways they're doing this, what we call is scoring, most of the ways that we score the bill looks like it'll be difficult for reconciliation. So they got to figure this out. There's either got to be enough cuts, or you can't have as many tax cuts to make that work. And where are those going to come from? So we don't actually know what those will be yet. This is just the framework, again, because it's reconciliation as opposed to a more standard bill process. On the Democrat side, I'm curious about some of your thoughts on this as well, Ken. And this is out there in public. Democrats are kind of trying to talk with each other. Okay, depending on where the votes fall, what do we do? Do we try to help the Republicans pass a bill Or do we try to stop them and maybe shut the government down? Playing the shut the government down game is always a difficult one. Republicans are usually the ones kind of, waving that particular sword. And Democrats haven't come out and said, hey, we're going to do that. But they have clearly been talking about it and signaling it's a possibility, at least in some quarters. So that's where we are right now. So what are your thoughts on the House's framework for a budget bill, or one beautiful bill?
Yeah, I was surprised that they actually managed to pass anything. So I would have predicted that they wouldn't have been able to do that. So they've already, if I had to make that prediction earlier, I would have had one wrong prediction. But going forward, I still think they got a lot of problems. Like the basic reasons I thought that they wouldn't be able to pass the bill is because I thought that you'd have maybe a few more votes along the lines of Massey's vote saying, I'm not going to vote for a budget that doesn't come anywhere near balancing or even reducing the present deficits. Massey turned out to be the only vote like that. But I think part of the reason he turned out to be the only vote like that is that the bill that they did pass allowed for certain kinds of magical thinking, because even though Trump has been out there in public saying he won't cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, I think there's general consensus maybe among the Republicans that I'm sorry, my phone's ringing, but just ignore that. That they're not gonna cut Social Security or Medicare. But I think there's a lot of Republicans who do want to cut Medicaid, but yet there's some Republicans who won't vote for it if it actually cuts Medicaid. And so, the way they got this bill passed was by telling those Republicans, look, there's no Medicaid cuts in this bill, so you can vote for it. And so they did vote for it, but yet telling the other Republicans, look, we're going to make enough spending cuts to pay for the bill, so you can vote for it. And so I think they cobbled together the votes that way.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
Empower. Claire is practicing her breathing for her upcoming yoga retreat in Bali. Has she ever done yoga before? No. But Claire worked with Empower on her savings and investment strategy. She got good at money, so she can be a little bad. Empower. Invest well, live a little. Join our 19 million customers today at empower.com.
Past performance is not indicative of future returns. Investing involves risks. You may lose money. Advisory services are provided for a fee by Empower Advisor Group, LLC, EAG, a registered investment advisor with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Om Namaste.
And I think only Massey really was the one who called bullshit on it. But I think when it comes down to it, I think when they have to actually say, well, where are you going to, make the spending cuts? Or if you're not going to make the spending cuts, how are you going to get this anywhere near balancing? They're going to lose a few more votes, in the House. And I think they're going to need some Democratic votes. And so that comes around to your second question of what are the Democrats going to do? The Democrats have said, one thing that they want, and the Republicans have said that it's a non-starter. And, the one thing they've said so far is that they want it right in the bill that the president will not impound any funds and that he will actually release all the funds that are appropriated and make Trump sign that. And the Republicans have said they're not going to put that in there. My view is they should all vote no if that's not in there. I cannot see any reason at all. I'm not predicting what they will do, but I'll just say I see zero reason to keep the government open. If keeping the government open means keeping open the parts of it that do the things that Trump wants to do and not keeping open the other parts of it that Congress has actually bargained for and voted on.
Yeah, I mean the one downside to that, again, here's my presidential scholarness coming out. In the contemporary era, there would be nothing that would stop a signing statement from Trump saying, this is a violation of my powers. I'm signing this bill with the understanding that the provision that says that I won't withhold spending is in fact unconstitutional, and I will ignore it. That's similar things to what both George W. Bush did, and not as frequently, but a couple of times Obama did.
Yeah, no, I think none of them did it in exact situations where representations to get congressional votes had actually depended on them promising not to do that.
Oh,
so
no, I'm not saying it's comparable in that sense. I just meant in areas where there was a piece of the bill and they said, okay, we're going to sign it.
Signing statements. No, I agree that Trump might do that, but I also think the Dems in the House have one other protection against that, which is they can only agree to, they don't have to agree to very long-term resolutions. Like these continuing resolutions, could be for only 60 days or 90 days, and they could make a representation. We'll come back and do the same one again in 60 days or 90 days, as long as he keeps his promise to, release the funds that we've actually appropriated. And if he doesn't keep that promise, then we're done. And I think that would be the way they would police that. But again, I don't. Because I don't trust Trump at all, and I don't, I don't think they should do that. I think that's a second best solution in my mind. Like I think the solution I would have is just vote no and let the Republicans see if they can pull majorities together.
So now here's my question, though. But here's my question, and this is an honest one. Yeah. Historically, when you look back, and again, most recently, Republicans have been the ones to hold the hey, we're not gonna, we're gonna allow government to lapse. It generally, whether it ought to or not, the party that is the non-vote givers tend to take it pretty hard on the chin from voters, whether or not they necessarily ought to take it on the chin. And so I'm just wondering if you think, given that this is potentially a problem for Republicans, do Democrats accidentally end up giving them cover if they are then framed as the shutting government down? Because then you're sitting there and you go, look, we could have, but these bipartisan guys didn't want to be bipartisan.
I think it's a very serious issue that you raised, but I'm going to stand by my own advice I gave to the Democrats, which is, So I think that for one thing, it is a fact that the Republicans have a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and the White House. The Republicans have the responsibility to govern. It's not the Democrats' responsibility to govern. They are the minority party everywhere, and they have no power at all. And the Republicans could do everything without them if the Republicans are just willing to vote for their own budget. The other thing about this is I think you have to put this in the context of what the general public is seeing right now, which is that the White House very unilaterally is impounding a lot of funds and shutting down big sections of the government. And so the government is going to be at least half shut down by Trump, no matter whether Congress passes a budget or not. And I think Trump is really owning that. And finally, I think you have to look at the, kind of partisan polarization. The number of voters who really are going to swing one way or the other, depending on who they perceive as likely responsible for the shutdown, I think that's pretty small. I think all the Democrats are going to blame it on the Republicans. All the Republicans are going to blame it on the Democrats. And there's not a lot of swing voters out there, not to mention that we're a long time before the next election right now. So there's going to be many intervening issues that will become voting issues even before the November midterms in 2026. I think for all those reasons, I'd be less worried about that. But yet I agree with you that your basic analysis of the historical fundamentals there, that historically, if one party is mostly voting to keep the government open and one party is mostly voting to shut the government down, that's a problem for the party that's voting to shut the government down. I agree with that. I just think that for the reasons I just said, that won't apply this time.
And there's some mitigating factors effectively there.
Yeah.
Well, let's, one of the other things we wanted to get into, and you're already talking about it there, so let's start bringing it into the conversation in a real way, was this was kind of the late break item last weekend, but right after Mike and Jay had done the show was Doge, where Elon Musk sends out an email demanding federal employees come up with 5 things they accomplished with a deadline of this past Monday at 11:59 p.m. as part of this larger process that we've been talking about, i.e. withholding money and, as you were putting it, trying to shut down half of the government, right? And so that comes out. Musk told reporters that the goal was to make sure, and this was his words, not mine, that they had 2 functioning neurons. And Trump argued that it would weed out all the fake employees. Now, I'm going to have to ask, I've worked at some really big institutions. I don't know how many fake fake employees I have ever uncovered, regardless of size. But let's put that aside for a minute, I guess. Press Secretary Leavitt told reporters that 1 million workers have chosen to participate in, quote, in this very simple task of, again, sending 5 bullet points to your direct supervisor or manager, end quote. But that's not really as accurate as it could be. She said that the agency heads are ultimately responsible for deciding whether the employees should send their lists to DOJ. But the problem is that original message sparked a ton of confusions, and several agencies told their workers to ignore the request, including the Justice Department, the FBI, the State Department, the Pentagon, the Department of Energy, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, in part because the things that people are doing ought not probably be in emails sent out just over systems, right? There's a lot of reasons here beyond just the job capabilities why, writing down what you're doing may or may not always be a good idea. So what made this even more problematic is that Musk, and he seems to be trying to govern on X, is the best way I can put this. He posted on X that any workers who did not comply would be fired, which obviously is in contradiction, which was being said more formally-ish. Several agency heads went ahead and still said no. Then officials of the Office of Personnel Management then sent out an email on Monday instructing workers that the directive was voluntary. It said, quote, the email request was Musk, in response to that, said, quote, the email request was utterly trivial, as the standard for passing the test was to type out some words and press send. He'd go on to say, yet so many failed even that inane test, and so therefore he urged managers to make that happen. And so Trump himself then weighed in and said, quote, well, it's somewhat voluntary, but it's also, if you don't answer, I guess you get fired, end quote. That was the president's quote there. And so as a result, then on X, Elon said, subject to the discretion of the president, they will be given another chance. Failure to respond a second time will result in termination. So, you have the press secretary saying one thing, you have agencies saying something slightly different, you have Elon saying something one way in this email to employees. He is adding clarifying information or additional details only on social media, on X, and then at the same time, you have kind of those ambiguous statements coming from the president, well, it's somewhat voluntary, and I guess you get fired, but of course, that would need to be coming from him in some sense. So this is another one of, I thought this would be one of the weirder things we were going to cover until we had the meeting with Zelenskyy. But, here we are. So Ken, what are your thoughts about that? I don't even know how to phrase it into a question precisely, to be honest.
Well, I'll try to focus on the legal aspects of it. All of this is completely illegal. And the main way that it's been, happening is just because it's happening very quickly in a lot of contexts where, in many parts of the government, it's so unexpected that the employees that are affected really have no idea about what their legal rights are. Some of them are unionized, so there are a couple million unionized federal employees, and they are getting some help from their union, and there are union contracts that this violates. A lot of them are not unionized, and I think what you're seeing is faster responses from the segments of the government where lawyers are affected, and slower responses, but they're all going to come, I think, from other segments of the government. But besides union contracts, there's a lot of statutory civil service protections that apply to quite a lot of federal employees that are actually, give them statutory legal protections against arbitrary or capricious job actions, and even the probationary employees. And I've seen a lot of oversimplified reporting on this that's not exactly accurate, where everybody's hearing about these probationary employees. So a lot of this has focused on federal employees who are within the first year or two of their current jobs, who are called probationary employees. And some of the reporting is noting that they don't have the same full service civil service protections that they would get after their probationary period ends, and so that's why some of the terminations have focused on them. But the way that that's an oversimplification, there's two very important exceptions to that, which actually would apply to most probationary employees would fall within one of these two exceptions. So for most of them, it's actually not true that the fact that they're probationary means that they can just be dismissed like this. Many people that are probationary in a particular job title because they were promoted into it from another job title, right? So you could have people that are already having civil service protections, and then they get promoted up into a higher level job, and then they're probationary in that job. Now, if they're found in that job to have not done a good job, they don't have a civil service protection in that job, but they still have the civil service protection to be demoted back to their old job. But that's something that's been completely, totally ignored in the way these layoffs have been proceeding. And then the other exception that applies, and that will increasingly apply to more of them, is even for brand new hires, even for people that have only been on the job, a few months or something and didn't get promoted out of other jobs, they still have some civil service protection, not none. And the one that they're lacking, which more long-term employees would get, is the right to complain to the Merit Systems Protection Board, which is a federal agency that ordinary civil servants can file a complaint there if they think they were wrongly terminated, and the Merit Systems Protection Board can reinstate them if it finds that they were wrongly terminated. The probationary employees don't get that, but they still get the right to complain to a different unit called the Office of Special Counsel in the Justice Department. And if the Office of Special Counsel believes that a probationary employee was wrongly terminated, the Office of Special Counsel can bring that complaint to the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Merit Systems Protection Board can reinstate even a probationary employee. And that process has started. In fact, one of the people that Trump tried to fire very quickly was the head of the Office of Special Counsel in the Justice Department. He's a guy named Hampton Dellinger, and he was appointed there by President Biden to a 7-year term. And he has strong civil service protections being head of the Office of Special Counsel, and can only be fired, on a showing that he's committed malfeasance or neglect of duty. And that's something that would have to be proved. So Trump fired him. And he went straight to court, and, being that his whole job is protecting employees against wrongful firings, he went straight to court and immediately got a temporary restraining order, putting him back into the job that he'd been fired from. And since he started doing that job, a couple things have happened. One is that is the very first case that Trump tried to take all the way to the Supreme Court. And Trump asked the U.S. Supreme Court to intervene and to sustain his firing of Hampton Dellinger. And there was a not completely satisfying Supreme Court decision, but they didn't help Trump, but they didn't completely reject his argument either. They just put the case in abeyance. And the Supreme Court said, well, this is only a temporary restraining order. It's going to expire very soon. We're not going to disturb the temporary restraining order. But if it matures into an injunction or a preliminary injunction, which could last for longer, then we'll review it then. So Dellinger got to keep his job. The Supreme Court didn't help Trump fire him and didn't disturb the district court's order that put him back in. But they said they might reconsider that. But meanwhile, since Dellinger got back in, he brought a bunch of cases on behalf of different probationary employees in different departments. He brought them all to the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Merit Systems Protection Board agreed with him in all those cases that all of those probationary employees were improperly terminated and need to be reinstated. And then Dellinger said that he's got lists of hundreds of more wrongly fired probationary employees who are similarly situated, and he will be seeking reinstatement of all of them. So, these processes are starting. Other individuals who've been able to bring their own cases to the Merit Systems Protection Board have mostly been winning, and other fired employees who've been able to bring their cases into courts have generally mostly been winning. And even in the cases that they haven't been winning, the reasons that some employees have not been able to win these cases in court is that the courts have said that they have to go first to the Merit Systems Protection Board before they can go to court, and they can't go straight to court. So that's not actually, a victory for Trump. That's just telling the employees they've got to exhaust their administrative remedies before they go to court.
And that's something worth pointing out. I mean, again, you think about this all the time. You're teaching law, but when you're listening to the show, right, you can't go to the legal system in any context until, in general, you have exhausted your other avenues of resolving the dispute. So, for example, if I have a dispute with Oklahoma Christian University and it has to do with me, there's a process in our contract. I can't, unless there's some other kinds of circumstances coming up, I can't ask the court to intervene until the university has made its final decision through that process. And that's similar to what you're saying here is, look, there's another avenue that you have to do first, and then you've exhausted those options, and now it becomes a justiciable issue, correct?
Yeah, and that there is a statute. I should explain. Merit Systems Protection Board is a federal agency itself. It was created. The current version of it was created in a statute that was enacted in 1978, but there's predecessors of it that go all the way back to 1883. And this is an agency within the government that exists specifically so that if civil servants have claims that they were improperly fired or improperly demoted because of prohibited reasons, generally, because of politics, that they have to go to that agency within the government and seek reinstatement. And then if they think they didn't get a fair hearing at that agency, then they can go to court. So some of these employees who have gone straight to court, have had their cases dismissed out on the grounds that they needed to go first to that agency. But some of them have already exhausted those remedies and gone to court and have been able to be reinstated. And some of them, if they go to the Merit Systems Protection Board, they may win there, or if they lose there, then they'll be able to go to court.
Yeah. So then that's the path forward. So what then? I mean, obviously, I think it's pretty straightforward to say that Musk doesn't understand legal things, in a deep way. And even I, as a non-lawyer, could have assessed that for you. What then do you think what's the real reason then for having do these 5 things, turn them in? Why do we continue to have Musk he's not really in charge of Doge? There's the secret other person that we can't tell you who's in charge of Doge. He's just advising the secret other person. What are we accomplishing there, you think?
Well, I think, one of it is just kind of intimidation tactics that a lot of federal employees may just think, my days are numbered. I might as well just get out.
Or who wants to have to fuss with it? If your employment is awful enough, you might not just want to have to deal with it.
Right. So I think that's the main thing that they're doing. And then I think also, it depends on what kind of buy-in he gets from the other heads of agencies, because, as you pointed out before, some of the other heads of agencies, interestingly, Kash Patel, who you would think might be the most aligned with Trump and Musk, he was actually the first agency head to instruct all his employees to ignore all this. Right. So at the FBI, Kash Patel sent out, his first thing he did after he was confirmed, he sent out a notice to all FBI employees: don't answer any of these stupid emails. This doesn't apply to you.
Yeah, he was that part of what we were talking about it a second ago. Yeah, you don't think about that, but that Patel's the head of the FBI. Yeah, continue.
Yeah, and only the head of an agency can actually fire anyone in the agency. So Doge cannot fire anyone in an agency. So if the agency head isn't going to go along with it, it really means nothing. But on the other hand, some of the agency heads will go along with it. And I think I'm forgetting the guy's name, but the new head of the Department of Transportation apparently sent an email to all his employees saying, you better answer these questions that are coming from Doge, or there's going to be consequences if you don't. And, if the head of the agency is putting his imprimatur behind this, then, I think employees, better do it, because, that could end up being used as a basis of saying, well, we're firing them for cause because we gave them a job responsibility to do, filling out this survey, and they wouldn't fill it out. And we interpret that as meaning they haven't been doing doing anything, because if they've been doing anything, they would have been able to tell us what they've been doing. So they must be doing a bad job. And so I think that, that kind of thing, it has, some real weight if an agency head wants to give it real weight. It has no real weight if an agency head doesn't want to give it any real weight. But I think DOGE is generally just, the trying to, shut down big parts of the government. And I wanted to add, when you said he doesn't know anything about these laws, which is certainly true, there's a lot of things he doesn't know anything about, not just laws. And I think he doesn't really know what these agencies do, and he doesn't know what these job functions are. And one thing I was reading was that, because he's very focused on the computer code, he figured out, which are the codes that they use to signify consultants. And he had this idea, well, consultants, we don't need consultants, and he's thinking about, maybe consultants from, management consulting firms like McKinsey that are going to do PowerPoint presentations and stuff like that. And he's thinking, why is the government paying any of these people to do anything? Let's just get rid of them all, which if that's what they were, I would agree with him on that. But the thing is, that's not the way those codes are actually used in the government system. And so, you might be talking about, like, I think one of the ones that he ended up cutting was the military hires a consultant to help them test the equipment that they use to detect radiation, so that, they don't have the expertise to figure out whether that equipment is actually working properly. So they hire a consultant to come in and just make sure that the equipment's working properly, so that if soldiers have to go out, into areas where there's radiation, they have good working equipment to detect it. But that's also labeled as a consultant. And so he just cut all those people because he couldn't be bothered to figure out the difference between one kind of consultant and another kind of consultant. And I think there's a lot of that kind of thing going on. So there's a lot of ham-handedness and a lot of, arrogant kind of ignorance about, what these job functions actually are.
Arrogant ignorance. That is, you have coined the phrase.
Yeah.
That is absolutely it. Yeah, because it's funny the way you put that. That is the same way that I was going to finish up thinking about Musk. He is the student who couldn't pass Intro to American Politics, explaining to me, why government ought to or ought not do some particular thing. And you keep sitting there thinking, tell me, okay, explain how Congress works to me one more time, and then maybe I'll believe that you figured out, the right way to balance the budget. Again, not to say, I think one of the things that's kind of terrible, I find it terrible, is the idea that we would want to think about and actually have an efficient government. That's like, yay. But also the problem here is not this way, right? Not in an illegal way, not with a person who, if he really is going to be heading an agency, ought to have been in front of the Senate. And hasn't been. Yeah. Not when we're pretending that there's some invisible other person who's really managing this renamed agency. Well, not even agency, this renamed task force and doing things. And so I love that description. So.
And I'll add that, if we really wanted, more efficient government, which of course is something everybody wants, the number one best tool that we ever had for that were these inspectors general. And he fired them all, right? Trump fired them all. Yeah. Like, that's exactly, like, people who are extremely expert in what the agencies do and how they're doing it, and whose whole job is to look into problems. Are there things that they're not doing right? Are there things is there fraud? Is there waste? Is there abuse?
I think the problem that we are encountering, and this is a larger cultural issue as well, is there is this push to suggest that it is the intrinsic nature of expertise that is slowing us down from getting real things done. As a matter of fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was really stunned. I won't get into the details of who, but there was a person who told me, well, that's exactly what an academic, and that word was just dripping, that's what an academic would do, because I had suggested that there was something we ought not to do, right? Otherwise, I was going the other way. We probably shouldn't. That's not a good idea. But, oh, you're getting in the way. That's what an academic would do. And I think the implication here isn't just local, although it is. I mean, you work at institution, higher institution. Yep. But this idea that individuals who know how these things work, who have studied them for a long time, that what we really are is we're just kind of petty, evil people who are just trying to get in the way of the doers.
Yeah.
And I think that's a broader, again, that doesn't doesn't justify this, but I think that is part of what makes, I know from our point of view, Doge terrible. But when you ask people, it's still relatively popular. And in part, I think it's the same kind of individuals who would tell you, oh, that's what an academic would say. And I can hear that same kind of thing going, oh, Ken, that's what a lawyer would say.
Yeah. Right. Well, as we see all these like near plane crashes or plane crashes, I think it's not so academic to say, maybe they shouldn't have gotten rid of 400 FAA employees. And, when the agency was already understaffed, and now we're just seeing more and more problems in the air. But I get that some people might think, oh, that's just what an academic would say. Yeah.
The idea of I don't want an expert. Well, Ken, this has been wonderful. It wasn't exactly what we thought we were going to do, but we got most of what we were going to do done, plus some extra. So listeners, I hope that you loved it. Ken, it's been fun doing the show with you this week. But we're not done. We're not done yet. Because remember, Ken and I, as soon as we get done here, we're going to be recording our midweek show. And as always, Ken and I do the U.S. Constitution. And this week we head off to the 18th Amendment. And we might even jump forward and do a little bit on the 21st because they go together. And you'll get to find all out about how you should not be drinking. Really, in all honesty, we should have had some beers while we were doing. So maybe we'll drink. I'm just teasing. It's too early. But be that as it may, we're going to be doing some continue our move through the U.S. Constitution. We're closing in on the end. We'd love for you to join us with that. So if you want to get the whole show, if you want to get all of that, you've got to be a supporter. So head down there into the show notes, click on the show notes, head to politicsguys.com/support, support the show, and you'll immediately be getting access to not only this week's midweek show with me and Ken, but every single Constitution show we've done. We have started with the preamble. We're almost through the amendments, and so we love that. And then don't forget, it's not just Ken and myself who do midweek shows. The other hosts do midweek shows as well. So there's all different kinds of plans. Again, please head to politicsguys.com/support to see all of those, or head on down there to the show notes. Don't forget, you can always email us at mail@politicsguys.com. It's helpful if you can subscribe, rate, or review. We need those algorithms, including, of course, sharing episodes. As always, I finish with some amazing individuals, and they are our executive producers. And the executive producers of the Politics Guys are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode, full episode next week, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,